The wind in dry juniper had a mean streak. It didn't just blow, it scoured. It scraped its bony fingers across the dead cottonwoods that lined the only street, a street pitted and rutted like it had taken a volley of buckshot. The town itself was little more than a collection of weary buildings huddled together against the vast, unforgiving Wyoming territory, seeking comfort in numbers and finding none. Inside the lean-to kitchen she rented behind the general store, Hannah Pike felt the wind push through the chinks in the walls. At 24, she had been out of the St. Jude Sewing Orphanage for 6 years, and every day felt like a lesson in the different qualities of cold. There was the sharp, biting cold of an empty stomach, the dull, aching cold of loneliness, and the pervasive, seeping cold of a town that looked right through you. Her kitchen was her world, a hulking cast-iron stove, its belly glowing a sullen red, dominated the space. The air was thick with the ghosts of yesterday's bread and the promise of tomorrow's stew. A dented tin ladle, polished to a dull sheen, hung from a nail next to a mismatched set of knives. This small, cramped space, smelling perpetually of wood smoke and lard, was the only place Hannah felt she had any real substance. She was a cook for hire, a service few in dry juniper could afford and even fewer appreciated. She baked for the saloon girls when they had a birthday, stewed venison for the blacksmith when his wife was birthing another child, and prepared salt pork and beans for the occasional passing trapper with a few coins to spare. The town had a name for her, spoken in whispers that were meant to be overheard. The plump cook. Sometimes, if the speaker was feeling charitable, it was the kind, quiet one. Her size, a testament to years of orphanage rations followed by the meager solace of her own cooking, defined her before her name ever could. She saw it in the eyes of Mr. Gable, the butcher. He was a man with a thin wife and a thinner smile. Every week, he would save the worst cuts for her, the gristly neck bones, the stringy shanks, pushing them across the counter with a look that was part pity, part disdain. "This'll make a fine soup for you, Hannah," he'd say, while wrapping a marbled steak for the banker's slender daughter. Hannah never argued. She would just nod, pay her pennies, and know that she could, in fact, make a fine soup from it. She could make anything fine if she had a fire and time. Tonight, the wind was a banshee. It rattled the single window pane and moaned down the stovepipe. Hannah had just finished cleaning up, the scent of caraway from a small seed cake she'd baked for herself still lingering. She sat on a low stool, her hands resting in her lap. They were not pretty hands. They were red and chapped, with short, clean nails and the faint, pale lines of old burns. They were working hands. She was tracing the pattern of the wood grain on her small table when a sound cut through the wind's howl. A knock. It wasn't a tentative tap. It was a solid, commanding rap of knuckles against her flimsy door. A sound that didn't belong to dry juniper's usual nocturnal traffic of drunks and stray dogs. Hannah froze. No one came to her door after dark. The knock came again, harder this time, impatient. She pushed herself up, her heart a nervous flutter against her ribs. Wiping her palms on her apron, she drew the simple bolt and opened the door a crack. The man standing on her stoop was as large as the sound of his knock. He filled the doorway, his wide-brimmed hat dusted with the fine powder of an early snow. A heavy sheepskin coat was pulled tight around him, and his face, illuminated by the spill of light from her kitchen, was all harsh angles and shadows. He looked like he'd been carved from the same hard land as the mountains that loomed to the west. She recognized him, of course. Everyone knew Rafe Calder. He owned the Slate Creek Ranch, a sprawling operation some 10 miles out of town. He was a man spoken of in terms of acreage and cattle heads, a man who rarely came into the settlement for anything but supplies or business at the bank. Miss Pike. His voice was low and rough, like gravel turning over. It wasn't a question so much as a confirmation. Hannah nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter. The cold that rushed in was immediate and sharp. "Mr. Calder." He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "My cook, Silas, took a fall. Busted his leg. The doc says he's done for the season." He paused, his eyes a startlingly clear, pale gray sweeping over her small kitchen, taking in the clean surfaces, the neatly stacked firewood, the lingering smell of honest food. Roundup starts in a week. I've got 25 men who'll be working from before sunup to after sundown. They need to be fed. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. Hannah understood what he was asking, but the sheer scale of it was staggering. 25 men. That wasn't baking a seed cake. That was a campaign. She found her voice, small and thin against the wind. I cook for folks here in town. Sir, small orders. I've heard, he said, and she couldn't tell if that was a good thing or a bad thing. They say you're clean and you're quiet. I need more than that. I need someone who can make something out of salt beef and beans for 6 weeks straight without my men turning on each other. Hannah's mind raced. The thought of Slate Creek was like the thought of a foreign country. It was a world of men, of hard work and harder talk. She was used to solitude, to the quiet bubbling of a pot and the gentle rhythm of kneading dough. Still, the offer hung in the air, smelling of possibility and panic. It meant steady pay. It meant purpose beyond waiting for the next small, pitying job. But it also meant facing a world that had never been kind to her, her insecurity, a constant, familiar companion, spoke for her. The words came out before she could stop them, a quiet, shameful truth she had carried for a lifetime. No one marries a fat girl, sir, but I can cook. It was a strange, desperate confession, a summary of her entire worth laid bare on her own doorstep. She was offering her one skill as a shield against the judgment of her appearance. She expected him to laugh, or at the very least, to offer a clumsy, polite dismissal. She braced herself for the sting of it. Rafe Calder did neither. His expression didn't change. The hard lines of his face didn't soften in pity or twist in amusement. He just looked at her, his gray eyes seeming to see past the worn dress and the extra weight to the stove glowing behind her. The silence deepened, and for a moment, Hannah thought he was simply going to turn and walk away. When he finally spoke, his words were as stark and practical as the landscape he ruled. I'm not marrying a cook, Miss Pike. He let that sink in, the statement clearing the air of her desperate, misplaced remark. I'm hiring someone to keep the fire alive for my men. The phrase struck her. Keep the fire alive. It was what she did. Wasn't it here in her little kitchen? Her stove was the only thing that truly pushed back the Wyoming winter. It was the heart of her small existence. He wasn't talking about romance or appearances. He was talking about work. He was talking about survival. Her gaze drifted past him to the dented ladle hanging by the stove. In its convex surface, her reflection was a grotesque caricature, a wide, distorted face, a body made shapeless and huge. It was how she imagined the world saw her. She heard the faint echoes of whispers from the orphanage, the snickers of girls who were chosen for adoption while she was handed another needle and thread. Too plain. Too big, Mr. Gable's dismissive wave of the hand. All the small, daily cuts that had carved her self-worth down to nothing but a single, marketable skill. But Rafe Calder hadn't flinched. He hadn't offered pity. He had offered a job. A hard one, based on the one thing she knew she could do better than anyone in Dry Juniper. He saw her not as a woman to be judged, but as a worker to be hired. And in that moment, that felt more respectful than any compliment she had ever received. A decision began to form, a fragile thing, but stubborn. She could stay here in her cold little kitchen, making soup from bones and waiting for the world to continue ignoring her. Or she could go with this man to a place where her work would be not just wanted, but necessary, where she would be judged not by her reflection in a spoon, but by the contents of the pot. Be ready at sunrise, Rafe said, taking her silence as assent. I'll send a wagon. He stepped back, and the space he had occupied was immediately filled by the frigid air. As he turned, he reached into a burlap sack he'd been carrying and set something on the edge of her stoop, a small, wild-looking bunch of green shoots, their roots still caked with damp earth, wild onions. "A cook needs ingredients," he said, his voice already being carried away by the wind. Then he was gone, a large shadow swallowed by the night. Hannah stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cold seeping into her bones. The only evidence he had been there was the faint, lingering scent of damp snow and horses, and the sharp, clean smell of the onions at her feet. It was a strange invitation. Not flowers, which would wilt and die, but food, a promise of flavor, a beginning. She picked them up, her fingers numb, and closed the door, sliding the bolt home. The kitchen, which had always been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. She walked over to the stove, the onions still in her hand. The wind clawed at the tin roof, a restless, scratching sound that echoed the turmoil in her own chest. On a small shelf above her workspace sat a little cloth-wrapped package tied with twine. It was her only inheritance, the head cook at St. Jude's, a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Gable, no relation to the butcher, had pressed it into Hannah's hand the day she left. "A good cook knows her spices," she'd said. "This is a start. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel small because you have a healthy appetite for life, child." Hannah touched the package now. The spices inside were a mystery, a blend Mrs. Gable had used in her holiday stews, a scent that smelled like the closest thing to home Hannah had ever known. She had been saving it for something special, though she'd never known what that might be. She looked from the spice packet to the wild onions on the table. One was her past, the other a possible future. Both smelled of sustenance, of keeping the fire alive. The faint, rhythmic sound of hoofbeats, already distant, reached her through the walls. He was riding away. The sound was a countdown. By morning, the wagon would be here. Her choice had to be made now, in the quiet of her kitchen, with the wind as her only witness. She stood motionless, her hand hovering over the cold iron latch of the door. To open it now would be to step back into the world that had made her, the world of whispers and loneliness. To keep it shut meant accepting the challenge of a new one. The hoofbeats faded into the relentless moan of the wind, leaving behind a silence that demanded an answer. Her fingers, chapped and calloused from 100 fires, closed around the latch. The sun was a rumor, a pale suggestion of light behind a solid gray sky. A layer of frost, delicate and sharp as crushed glass, coated every blade of dormant prairie grass. The wagon wheels crunched over the frozen earth, a rhythmic, grinding sound that had become the sole measure of time for Hannah. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her few belongings, a small carpet bag containing a change of clothes, her mother's spice packet, and the wild onions from Rafe Calder tucked beside her. The driver, a leathery old man named Jeb, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since they left Dry Juniper, kept his eyes on the matched pair of mules pulling them forward. Every jolt of the wagon was a reminder that she was leaving the only world she knew, small and unkind as it was, for something utterly foreign. She was a creature of contained spaces, the orphanage dormitory, the sewing room, her small kitchen behind the general store, the sheer, unending expanse of the Wyoming territory pressing in on all sides made her feel small and exposed, as if the wind could pick her up and carry her away without anyone noticing. After what felt like a lifetime, Jeb pointed with his chin. Slate Creek. Ahead, rising from the flat, frost-rimed land, was a gate. It was less a gate than a statement. 2 massive, weathered timbers, bleached nearly white by sun and snow, formed the posts. A long crosspiece rested atop them, and from it hung a heavy wooden sign with the words Slate Creek burned deep into the grain. The whole structure was stark and imposing, stripped of all softness, like the cleaned skeleton of some great beast that had fallen on the plains. It felt less like an entrance and more like a warning. As the wagon rolled through, the ranch proper came into view. It was a chaotic but orderly collection of buildings, a long, low bunkhouse, a massive barn that dwarfed everything else, a blacksmith's shed from which the faint clang of a hammer echoed, and a dozen other corrals and outbuildings, all weathered to the same uniform gray as the landscape. Men moved with purpose, their forms dark against the snow-dusted ground. They were leading horses, mending tack, carrying supplies. The air smelled of wood smoke, livestock, and cold. Clean earth. The wagon slowed to a halt in the center of the main yard, and a silence fell. One by one. The men stopped what they were doing and turned to look. Hannah felt their eyes on her, a collective weight of a dozen hard-faced strangers. They were lean and wiry, men shaped by the saddle and the sun, their faces hidden under the brims of their hats. For a long moment, the only sound was the snorting of the mules and the ever-present wind. Then, a low whistle cut through the air, sharp and sly. It was followed by a voice, young and carrying, from a group near the bunkhouse. "Well, look what the boss dragged in. Reckon our rations'll double this month, boys." A ripple of rough laughter followed, not cruel so much as casually dismissive. It was the kind of laughter Hannah had known her whole life, the kind that judged and dismissed in a single breath. She felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame that was as predictable as the sunrise. Her first instinct was to shrink, to make herself smaller, to disappear into the folds of her woolen shawl. But then she remembered Rafe Calder's words. "I'm hiring someone to keep the fire alive for my men." This wasn't the orphanage. She wasn't a charity case to be pitied or a town oddity to be whispered about. She was an employee. She had a job to do. Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the building Rafe had described to Jeb the cookhouse. It stood slightly apart from the others, a squat structure of dark, field-gathered stone, its roof patched with tin. She gathered her bag, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle, without looking at the cowboys, without acknowledging their presence. She slid off the wagon bench. Her boots hit the hard-packed earth with a solid thud. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, a flimsy armor against the cold and the stairs, and walked. Her path took her directly past the group that had laughed. She could feel their eyes on her back. She kept her chin up, her gaze locked on the moss-covered stones of the cookhouse. It was her destination. It was her territory. The heavy wooden door groaned open under her hand, protesting its disuse. A wave of cold, still air washed over her, smelling of stale grease, dormant embers, and the faint, sad scent of mice. The inside was larger than her kitchen in town, but far more primitive. A massive stone fireplace and hearth took up most of one wall, big enough to roast a whole side of beef. In the center of the room stood a black iron beast of a stove, cold and silent. A long, scarred wooden table, clearly built for communal meals, was surrounded by backless benches. Pots and pans, most of them cast iron and coated in a layer of grime, hung from hooks on the wall. It was a man's kitchen, built for function, not comfort, and it had been left to fend for itself since its master, Silas, had taken his fall. Hannah set her bag down on the dusty floor. This was it. This was her new world. It was cold and dirty and intimidating, but it was hers to command. She took off her shawl, folded it neatly, and then untied the strings of her apron, pulling it from her bag and tying it firmly around her waist. The simple, familiar action was grounding. This was her uniform. This was her purpose. Her first stop was the pantry, a small, cold room off the main kitchen. The sight that greeted her was both daunting and a relief. It was stocked, but with a monotonous predictability. There were huge sacks of pinto beans and cornmeal, a barrel of salt beef submerged in brine, another of salt pork, and a large wooden tub of rendered lard. Crates of coffee beans sat next to wooden boxes of salt and brown sugar. But that was it. There were no potatoes, no carrots, no onions beyond the small bunch she had brought with her. There was no flour for bread, no yeast, no dried apples for a pie. It was a larder of pure survival, a monotonous diet meant to fuel men, not to please them. Her task was not just to cook, but to create variety out of nothing. She returned to the main room. Before she could feed anyone else, she had to awaken the kitchen itself. She had to bring the fire back to life. She started with the stove, opening its iron doors and clearing out the old, cold ash. She found a wood box, half full of split logs and kindling. and methodically began to build a fire, laying the small sticks in a careful lattice before adding larger pieces. When she struck the flint, the spark caught on the dry tinder, and a fragile, tentative flame flickered to life. She nursed it, blowing gently, protecting it from drafts, until it grew into a confident blaze, and the stove began to radiate a gentle, spreading warmth. The smoke that puffed out before the draft caught was thick and acrid, stinging her eyes and making them water. She didn't wipe the tears away. Let them be for the smoke, she told herself. Just for the smoke. Next were the pots. She hauled the largest ones to a pump outside the back door, her arms straining against their weight. The water came out in a frigid, gasping rush. Using a handful of coarse sand from a bucket and a block of harsh lye soap, she began to scrub. The layers of old grease and soot fought back, but Hannah was relentless. It was hard, mindless work, and she lost herself in it. The rhythmic scraping of sand against iron, the ache in her shoulders, the biting cold of the water on her chapped hands, it all served to push the memory of the cowboy's laughter out of her mind. She wasn't a fat girl here. She was a force of will against grime. One by one, she transformed the dull, greasy pots into clean, dark vessels, ready for use. She was scrubbing the last great stew pot when a new sound broke her rhythm, the sharp, clean crack of an axe, splitting wood. She looked up. Rafe Calder was by the wood pile not 20 feet away, his coat off despite the cold. His sleeves rolled up to reveal powerful forearms. He swung the axe with an easy, efficient power, splitting logs into stove-sized lengths with single strokes. He wasn't watching her, wasn't supervising. He was simply working, refilling the wood box he knew she would soon empty. After a few minutes, he stacked a load of freshly split wood into his arms and carried it into the cookhouse, dropping it into the box with a hollow boom. He didn't offer any pleasantries or ask how she was settling in. His gray eyes took in the clean pot stacked by the hearth and the steady heat now radiating from the stove. A flicker of something approval perhaps passed through them. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice as practical as the axe in his hand. Hannah straightened up, wiping her wet hands on her apron. She met his gaze directly. She didn't ask for better ingredients. She didn't complain about the state of the kitchen. She gave him the simple, honest truth of what she required to do the job he had hired her for. Warm water and silence. A corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a recognition of her bluntness. He gave a single, sharp nod. The water will get warm. The silence is up to the men, but they learn fast when they're hungry. With that, he turned and left, leaving her in the growing warmth of her new domain. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Hannah began to plan. The men would be eating in the bunkhouse for this one last night. Tomorrow, breakfast would be her first test, her declaration of intent. She sat on an overturned crate, the firelight dancing on the stone walls, and pulled another crate lid onto her lap to serve as a makeshift desk, with a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She began to write. She had so little to work with. There would be no fluffy biscuits, no variety of breads. It had to be cornmeal, salt beef, beans, but it didn't have to be bland. She remembered the wild onions Rafe had given her, their sharp, green promise. She had her secret packet of spices from Mrs. Gable, and she had an idea. On the rough wood of the crate, she sketched out a menu, not just for tomorrow, but for the week, a rotating battle plan against monotony. For the morning, she decided on thick cornmeal griddle cakes, fried in lard until the edges were crisp. She would dice some of the onion greens and mix them into the batter, adding a surprising bite. The salt beef would be boiled to draw out the worst of the brine, then shredded and fried with a bit of chili powder she'd brought a poor man's hash. And the beans. There would always be beans. But instead of just boiling them, she would simmer them for hours with a spoonful of molasses from her own stores and the dregs from the men's coffee pot, a trick she'd learned to give them a deep, smoky flavor. The cookhouse was quiet now, save for the crackle and pop of the fire. The day's exhaustion settled deep into her bones, a satisfying ache from honest labor. She had claimed this space. She had scoured it clean and filled it with warmth. She had a plan. She set up a small cot in a corner near the hearth, the warmest spot in the room, and lay down, pulling a rough wool blanket over herself. But sleep didn't come easily. Through the stone walls, she could hear the distant sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. A horse's nicker, a man's low voice, the closing of a door. It was the sound of a world she was not yet a part of, a world that would judge her in the morning. The first hint of gray light was filtering through the single grimy window when she finally rose. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cookhouse was chilly again. She stoked the coals, adding fresh wood until the flames roared back to life. She set the giant coffee pot on the stove and began to mix the batter for the griddle cakes. Soon, the air filled with new smells: brewing coffee, frying salt beef, the sweet scent of cornmeal hitting a hot, greased griddle. It was her answer to their laughter. It was her opening argument. In the distance, a heavy iron triangle clanged, the sound sharp and clear in the cold morning air. The breakfast bell. It was a summons, a challenge. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of her work. She had taken their dirtiest pots and made them clean. She had taken their cold hearth and given it a heart of fire. Now, could she take their crude provisions and make a meal that would force 25 hungry, skeptical men to see her as something more than the butt of a joke? The sound of heavy boots crunching on the frozen ground was getting closer. The jury was coming. The heavy tread of boots on the frozen ground announced their arrival. The cookhouse door swung open, and the first of the cowboys shuffled in, bringing a gust of frigid morning air with them. They were a rough-looking assembly, their faces chapped by the wind and their movements stiff from the cold. A low murmur of conversation filled the room, the men stamping their feet and rubbing their hands together, their eyes going first to the roaring stove, then to the silent woman standing beside it. Hannah didn't speak. She let the kitchen speak for her. The air was no longer cold and stale. It was a thick, layered tapestry of smells that caught the men mid-sentence, quieting their chatter. First was the sharp, clean scent of strong coffee, black and bitter, the promise of a morning jolt. Beneath that was the hearty, earthy smell of pinto beans, slow simmered for hours, not just in water, but with a richness that hinted at something more. And woven through it all was the savory, irresistible aroma of sizzling fat and seasoned meat, overlaid with the sweet, nutty fragrance of cornmeal crisping on a hot griddle. It was the smell of a real breakfast, not the grim, functional fuel they were used to. It smelled like care. The men fell silent as they shuffled into line, tin plates and mugs in hand. They watched her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Hannah moved with a calm, efficient grace, her hands sure and steady. On one end of the long serving table sat a mountain of griddle cakes, golden brown and flecked with the dark green of the wild onions. They weren't the pale, flimsy things Silas used to make. These were thick and substantial, with crisp, lacy edges from the hot lard. A dusting of red chili flakes gave them a faint, inviting blush. Next to them was a deep iron pot of the coffee-stewed beans. They were the color of rich mahogany, their sauce thick and clinging. She'd added a spoonful of dark molasses, a secret indulgence from her own meager stores. It was a trick Mrs. Gable had taught her. A touch of sweetness, not to make the dish sweet, but to deepen the flavor, to give it a soul that spoke of hearth and home. It makes a man remember his mother's kitchen, even if he never had one. The old cook had said. Finally, there was the salt beef. It wasn't served in tough, boiled chunks. Hannah had patiently shredded the meat with 2 forks, pulling it into fine strands. She'd then fried it in hot lard with a generous shake of cumin from her precious spice packet. The result was a mound of crispy, savory threads of meat, a dish born of poverty but refusing to taste of it. It was poor, but it was not humble. The men filed past, and Hannah filled their plates. A scoop of beans, a tangle of fried beef, and 2 heavy griddle cakes. She worked without looking at their faces, focusing instead on the plates. ensuring each man got a fair and generous portion. The clatter of her serving spoon against their tin plates was the only sound in the room. They took their food to the long tables and sat. For a moment, they just looked at their plates. Then, tentatively, the first man took a bite. A fork scraped, a jaw moved, and a profound silence descended upon the cookhouse. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a silence of intense, focused activity. The only sounds were of chewing, of forks scraping against tin, of mugs being set down on the rough wooden tables. The usual morning banter, the jokes and complaints, were completely absent, replaced by a universal, unspoken truce of pure satisfaction. Hannah watched from her station by the stove, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw men close their eyes for a moment as they tasted the beans. She saw them use a piece of griddle cake to mop up every last bit of sauce from their plates. They ate slowly, deliberately, not shoveling the food in as they usually did, but savoring each mouthful. The young cowboy who had made the joke about her doubling their rations, a lanky, freckle-faced boy named Billy, was seated in the middle of the longest table. Hannah had noticed him watching her with a wary eye as he came through the line. Now, he ate with his head bent low over his plate, his hat pushed back on his head. He finished before anyone else, his plate wiped clean. For a full minute, he sat there, staring at the empty tin surface. Then, without a word, he stood up, walked back to the serving table, and held out his plate. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on his boots, a deep red flush creeping up from his collar. It was the most profound apology she had ever received. Hannah took his plate and placed another griddle cake and a smaller scoop of beans on it. She understood. Words were cheap and often clumsy. An empty plate offered for more was an act of surrender, an admission. It was the language of the hungry, and she was fluent in it. As she refilled his plate, she was already learning the silent preferences of the men she was feeding. She saw an older man with a graying mustache carefully pick the small green bits of onion from his griddle cake. He doesn't like onions. She saw another man, broad-shouldered and quiet, sniff at his plate before eating the beef, his nose wrinkling slightly, not fond of cumin. The young boy, Billy, ate everything, but he lingered over the beans, his expression almost wistful. He misses home. She filed the information away, cataloging the appetites and aversions of her new charges. This was her work, not just the cooking, but the knowing. When the last man had eaten his fill, Rafe Calder appeared in the doorway. He hadn't joined the rush for food, but had stood outside, a silent, assessing presence. The room quieted even further at his arrival. He moved with an unhurried confidence, picking up a plate and a mug. Hannah served him the same meal she had served the others. He didn't take it to the table. He leaned against the door frame, one shoulder resting against the cold wood, and ate standing up, his pale gray eyes looking out over the ranch yard as the sun finally broke through the clouds. He ate with the same quiet intensity as his men, finishing every last bite. Hannah held her breath, waiting for the verdict. This was the one that mattered. He was the man who had hired her, the one who had seen a worker where others saw only a shape. He finished his coffee, setting the empty mug down on the edge of the serving table. He looked at the clean plates, the satisfied men slowly rising to start their day's work, and then his gaze settled on her. It was a level, unreadable look. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low but carrying in the now quiet room. "The same, or better." He turned and walked out, his form silhouetted against the bright morning light. It wasn't praise, it was a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. For Hannah, it felt like a cornerstone being set in place. Or better, he was telling her he knew she had more to give. He was expecting it. A small, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. The men filed out, pulling on gloves and hats, their movements now quicker, more energized. A few of them nodded in her direction as they left. It was a small gesture, but it was a world away from the whistles and jokes of yesterday. Billy, the young cowboy, was the last to leave. He paused at the door, turned, and for the first time, met her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am," he mumbled, his face turning red again before he quickly disappeared, left alone in the sudden quiet. Hannah looked at the wreckage of the meal, a mountain of dirty plates, empty pots, and the lingering, satisfying smell of a well-cooked breakfast. She had survived her first test. She had kept the fire alive. The work, however, was far from over. Lunch for 25 hungry men was only a few hours away. She would make a thick stew, something that could simmer for hours while she cleaned. She went to the pantry to take stock. She had the salt beef. She had the beans. She had the cornmeal. The stew would need a thickener, and more importantly, it would need fat for flavor and substance. She walked over to the large wooden tub of lard she had seen the day before. She lifted the heavy wooden lid, and her heart sank. The tub was nearly empty. What she had thought was a full supply was only a thin layer spread across the bottom. The griddle cakes had used up nearly all of it. There might have been enough left to fry one man's supper, but certainly not enough to form the base of a stew for the entire ranch, let alone provide for the dozens of meals that the coming week would require. The cookhouse, which had felt like a victory a moment before, suddenly felt like a trap. The breakfast bell would ring for the midday meal in 4 hours. 4 hours to solve a problem that felt as vast and empty as the Wyoming plains outside her door. She had won their silence with a single meal, but hunger was a relentless beast, and silence could quickly turn back into mockery if she failed to feed it. She stood alone in the pantry, the smell of her small triumph already fading, replaced by the cold scent of impending failure. The panic was a cold, hard knot in Hannah's stomach. An empty lard tub was a death sentence for a ranch cook. It was the foundation of everything for frying, for baking, for adding richness to the endless pots of beans. Her small victory at breakfast felt like a fluke, a lucky shot in the dark before the real battle was lost. She stood in the pantry, the cold seeping up through the soles of her boots, her mind a frantic blank. There was no one to ask, nowhere to get more. She was alone with the failure. Then, a thought, sharp and clear as a butcher's knife, cut through the panic, missed her. Gable had always given her the worst cuts, but even the worst cuts had something to give. She remembered the massive barrel of salt beef. It was packed in brine, but it was beef nonetheless. Beef had fat. With renewed purpose, she dragged a heavy side of the salted meat from the barrel onto a clean wooden board. It was a struggle, the waterlogged meat heavy and unwieldy. Using her sharpest knife, she began to work. Not as a cook, but as a butcher. She trimmed away every significant piece of the thick, white, fat cap, her knife moving with a skill born of years of making the most out of the least. It was a slow, painstaking process. She rendered the trimmings in a heavy pot over a low flame, the kitchen slowly filling with the rich, familiar smell of melting tallow. The fat hissed and popped, releasing its liquid gold. By the time the midday bell was set to ring, she had a small but sufficient pot of clean, rendered beef fat. She had made something from nothing. The stew that day was thick and savory, the men none the wiser to the crisis that had preceded it. That evening, the rhythm of her new life began to find its beat. After the last cowboy had left the cookhouse, full of stew and cornbread, Hannah faced the mountain of tin plates and greasy pots. It was a daunting sight. A second shift after a day that had started long before dawn. She filled a massive kettle with water and set it on the stove to heat, her shoulders aching with a weariness that was bone deep. As she began to scrape the plates, the door opened. Rafe Calder stepped inside, not with an order or a question, but with his sleeves rolled up. He walked to the sink pump, took the handle, and with a few powerful strokes, filled a rinsing basin with cold, clear water. Hannah stopped, a greasy plate in her hand. "Sir, you don't need to do that. This is my work." He didn't look at her. He picked up a rough cloth and a block of lye soap. His hands, which she had seen handle the reins of a horse with authority and split wood with brute force, were surprisingly methodical as he began to wash the first plate, scrubbing it clean before placing it in her rinse water. "You cook," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the kitchen's own quiet hum. "I clean." It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, a new term in their unspoken agreement. Hannah wanted to protest again, to insist that it wasn't his place, that the owner of Slate Creek shouldn't be scrubbing the plates of his hired hands, but the finality in his tone stopped her. More than that. Something else stopped her. The sight of him standing there, working beside her, created a small, quiet space in the vast, lonely landscape of her life. It was a partnership, unspoken and unasked for, but real nonetheless. So she said nothing. She rinsed the plates he washed, and together, they worked through the pile. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the scrape of cutlery, the slosh of water, and the soft thud of clean plates being stacked on the drying rack. In the firelight, their shadows grew long on the stone walls, two figures moving in a shared, synchronized task. A rhythm. He carried the water. She kept the fire. He scrubbed the grime of the day away, and she prepared for the nourishment of the next. Days bled into a week, and the rhythm held. A pattern of small habits began to form, weaving a delicate, invisible thread between them. One afternoon, Hannah decided to try making bannock, a simple, unleavened flatbread she could bake on the griddle. The pantry lacked proper flour, but she found a sack of finely ground corn flour, almost like dust. She mixed it with water and a pinch of salt, her hands moving deftly. She set a tray of the pale, flattened dough on the deep windowsill to rest before baking. A couple of the half-wild ranch cats, drawn by the warmth of the cookhouse, had taken to sunning themselves on the porch. A young calico, bold and curious, leaped onto the sill, its paw batting playfully at the edge of the flour-dusted tray. The tray tipped. A cloud of fine, white flour puffed into the air, coating the cat, the windowsill, and the front of Rafe, who had been walking past at that exact moment. Hannah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Rafe stood frozen for a second, a light dusting of white on his dark shirt and the brim of his hat. The cat, startled, sneezed a tiny, floury puff and scampered away. Rafe looked down at his shirt, then at Hannah, whose face was a mixture of horror and suppressed amusement. He slowly raised a hand and wiped a streak of flour from his cheek. A slow smile spread across his face, a rare sight that transformed his harsh features. And then he let out a low, rumbling laugh. The sound startled Hannah. It was a genuine, unguarded sound. And it was infectious. A giggle escaped her, then another, until she was laughing too, a sound that felt rusty and unused, like a hinge on a long-shut door. They stood there for a moment, the stern ranch owner and his quiet cook, sharing a laugh over a cloud of spilled flour, the air between them suddenly lighter. She noticed other things, too. She learned the men's hungers were not just for food. The young cowboy, Billy, always seemed to linger after the others had gone, his eyes straying to the cooling rack. He looked barely 18, with a constant, haunted look of homesickness about him. One night, after her laughter with Rafe, Hannah felt a surge of something like courage. She took 2 of the leftover bannocks, spread them with a bit of molasses, and left them on the windowsill inside the cookhouse before she retired to her cot. Hours later, through the quiet hum of the dying fire, she heard the soft creak of the door and the faint sound of someone gratefully munching. She never mentioned it, and he never asked, but every night thereafter, 2 cooled cakes were waiting on the sill. Her own needs were simple, almost non-existent, but the Wyoming nights were colder than anything she had ever known. Her blanket, a thin, patched quilt from the orphanage, was no match for the drafts that snaked through the stone walls. One evening, she sat by the fire, her sewing kit in her lap, painstakingly stitching another patch onto a threadbare section. She saw Rafe pause by the open door, his shadow falling over her for just a moment before he moved on. She thought nothing of it. The next morning, when she unbolted the door to fetch water, she found something on the stoop. It was a heavy, dark gray wool blanket, thick and tightly woven. It was old and smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, but it was clean and whole. There was no note, no explanation, It was just there, a silent provision. That night, for the first time since arriving at Slate Creek, Hannah slept without shivering. The cowboys, too, began to change. The overt mockery had stopped after the first breakfast, replaced by a wary, respectful distance. Now, that distance was shrinking. They started stacking their own plates after meals instead of leaving them scattered on the tables. One afternoon, a grizzled old hand named Charlie, whose hands were gnarled with arthritis, quietly left a bucket of perfectly shaped kindling by the wood box. The most significant change came from an unexpected source, a quiet, serious man named Thomas, who spent his evenings whittling, approached the serving table one night after dinner. He didn't say a word. He simply placed a small object on the table beside her pots and then walked away. It was a spoon, carved from a single piece of pale cottonwood. It was not ornate or perfect. The marks of the knife were still visible. But it was smooth and balanced. The bowl of the spoon perfectly curved. It was a tool, made by hand, given as a sign of respect. Hannah picked it up, the wood warm and light in her hand. She used it to serve the beans the next morning. A new rumor began to circulate through the bunkhouse, replacing the old one about her size. It was spoken in quieter, more thoughtful tones. It started, perhaps, because she knew to give Charlie the stew with the softest boiled vegetables for his old teeth, or because she always had a strong, sweet coffee ready for the night watchman, or because Billy's homesickness seemed to be easing with every nightly cake she left for him. They couldn't explain how she knew what they needed before they did, so they gave it a name. The cook, the new whisper went. She can hear a man's stomach. The quiet rhythm of the ranch settled into a comfortable peace. The days were long and full of hard work, but they were predictable. The sizzle of the morning griddle, the low bubble of the midday stew, the silent partnership of the evening cleanup. For the first time in her life, Hannah felt as if she belonged somewhere. Her world was the cookhouse, a warm, fragrant island in a sea of cold plains, and she was its heart. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, Hannah was kneading dough for the next day's bread. The men were out on the far range, pushing a herd of newly bought cattle into the north pasture. A deep, peaceful quiet had settled over the ranch yard. It was shattered by a sound. It was not a bell or a human voice. It was a long, mournful, panicked blast from a steer horn, the signal for absolute emergency. It echoed off the barn and rolled across the yard, a sound of pure dread. Hannah's hands stilled in the dough. She rushed to the door and looked out. In the distance, against the setting sun, she could see a cloud of dust, a roiling, chaotic mass that was moving with terrifying speed, a stampede. And it was heading toward the main corrals. Shouts and yells erupted from the few hands left at the ranch as they scrambled for horses, for ropes, for anything to turn the tide. Her first instinct was to turn back to her stove, to guard the fire, to ensure the pot of beans for dinner didn't burn. That was her job. Her place was here. But then she saw the face of Jeb, the old driver, as he ran past, his expression grim with fear. She saw the ranch gates, the ones that had looked like a skeleton, now looking fragile and weak against the oncoming storm of hooves and horns. The men she fed every day, the men who had slowly, quietly accepted her, were out there, in the path of that danger. The fire in her hearth was safe and contained. The fire in the yard was chaos. Both needed tending. Her hands, covered in flour, trembled. For the first time, the cookhouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, and she was caught between the fire she was paid to keep and the fire that threatened to consume them all. The rain did not arrive gently. It was heralded by a sudden, deep-throated roar from the west, from the jagged peaks of the Blue Spine Mountains. The sky, which had been a placid, dusty blue moments before, turned the color of a fresh bruise. Then the storm hit Slate Creek not as rain, but as a physical assault. It was a solid wall of water that slammed into the ranch, battering the roofs of the barn and the bunkhouse. turning the hard-packed dirt of the yard into a churning sea of mud. Hannah stood in the doorway of the cookhouse, watching the world dissolve. The wind clawed at the building, and the sound of the rain on the tin-patched roof was a deafening, continuous drum roll. Slate Creek itself, normally a placid ribbon of water that gave the ranch its name, was already beginning to swell. It was no longer a creek, it was a torrent, a brown, churning beast, swallowing its banks and carrying with it a debris of broken branches and clumps of uprooted prairie grass. Her first and only thought was of the men. They were still out there. Caught in this, they would be cold, soaked to the bone, and exhausted when they finally made it back. They would need warmth. They would need food. Her fire. She pushed the heavy door shut against the force of the wind, the latch groaning as it caught. The cookhouse, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a small, fragile boat in a raging ocean. The storm seemed to be trying to force its way in, pressing against the stones, whistling through the cracks. She turned to the stove, her movements deliberate and focused amidst the chaos. She fed it log after log, her face illuminated by the hungry orange glow. The fire roared in defiance of the storm, a beating heart of warmth against the cold, wet fist of the world outside. The massive coffee pot was already on, its contents simmering, ready. A pot of bean soup, thick with the last of the salt beef, bubbled on the back burner, filling the small space with a thick, reassuring aroma. This was her duty. This was her post. The wooden bridge that spanned the creek, the only way back to the main ranch buildings, began to tremble. Hannah could hear its low, groaning protest even over the roar of the rain. Water, brown and angry, was now lapping at the porch steps of the cookhouse. A dark tongue of it slid under the door, a cold, unwelcome intruder. It hissed as it touched the stone hearth, a sound like a snake. Soon, the floor was covered in a shallow, frigid pool. Her boots were soaked, and the hem of her dress was heavy with cold, muddy water. Still, she stayed by the stove, her anchor in the maelstrom. Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was thin and high-pitched, nearly lost in the cacophony of the wind and rain. At first, she thought it was a coyote, its cry twisted by the gale. But it came again, sharper this time, punctuated by a desperate, tearing sob. It was the sound of a child's cry. Hannah froze, the ladle in her hand hovering over the soup. She strained to listen, turning her head, her whole body an instrument of hearing. The cry came again, a raw, terrified wail from the direction of the bridge. Wiping her hands on her apron, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. Fighting against the pressure of the wind, the world outside was a nightmare of gray, driving rain and rising water. She peered through the deluge, her eyes stinging. The bridge was a treacherous skeleton, its planks slick and partially submerged, vibrating violently with the force of the current that battered its supports. And there, on the far side, a tiny, solitary figure stood. It was a child, small and drenched, its dark hair plastered to its face. Its clothes, whatever they were covered in a thick layer of mud, making it seem like a small creature born of the flood itself. It was standing at the very edge of the washed-out bank, unable to cross the raging water, its small face turned toward the light of her cookhouse. Hannah's heart seized in her chest. There was no one else. The few hands left at the ranch were at the far corrals, trying to keep the horses from panicking. It was just her. The child cried again, a sound of utter desolation. Thought was a luxury she couldn't afford. There was only action. Her eyes darted around the porch. A coil of heavy rope, used for hoisting sacks of flour, hung on a peg. It was thick and strong. Without a second's hesitation, she grabbed it. One end she looped around the thickest porch post, a solid oak timber sunk deep into the earth. She tested the knot with a savage pull. It held. The other end she tied around her own waist, the rough hemp biting into her skin even through her wet clothes. She took a deep breath, the cold, rain-filled air burning her lungs, and stepped off the porch. The shock of the water was brutal. It was colder than ice, a physical blow that stole her breath. The current was a living thing, a powerful, muscular force that immediately tried to tear her from her feet. It sucked and pulled at her skirts, a greedy, liquid hand trying to drag her down. The mud on the bottom was a thick, slimy trap, and with every step, she fought the suction that tried to claim her boots. She leaned into the current, her body a low, solid bulwark against the flood. Her weight, for so long a source of shame, was now her greatest asset. It was her anchor. She focused on the child, a small, wavering beacon in the storm. "I'm coming!" she yelled, her voice thin and immediately swallowed by the wind. The bridge was impassable. She had to wade through the churning water upstream of it, using the rope as her only lifeline. The water was at her waist now, pushing, relentlessly shoving. A piece of driftwood, heavy as a log, slammed into her hip, and she cried out, stumbling, the rope biting deep into her waist as it held her against the current. She regained her footing. Her teeth clenched. Her entire world narrowed to the next step, and the next, and the next. She reached the child. It was a little girl, no older than 5, her brown skin cold and clammy, her dark eyes wide with a terror so profound it had gone past tears. She was shivering violently, her small body trembling without pause. Hannah didn't waste a moment. She untied the rope from her own waist, her fingers numb and clumsy, and looped it securely around the child's small torso, under her arms. "Hold on to me," Hannah said, her voice firm and steady despite the chattering of her own teeth. "Hold on tight." The little girl just stared, paralyzed by fear. Hannah scooped her up, the child a surprisingly light, cold weight in her arms. Now came the harder part, the return journey. She was pulling against the current now, with the dead weight of the child making every step a monumental effort. The rope was her guide, her connection to safety, but it felt impossibly long. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the storm, the thunder of hooves, closer and more frantic than the thunder in the sky. A dark shape materialized out of the rain, a massive horse and rider, plunging through the water at the edge of the yard. It was Rafe. He must have ridden ahead of the others, taking the high ground. He reined his horse to a halt at the edge of the porch, his face a mask of grim urgency. He saw her. He saw the child. He understood the entire situation in a single, sweeping glance. He didn't yell instructions. He acted. Leaping from the saddle, he grabbed a second rope from his horse, tied one end to the same porch post, and with the other in his hand, plunged into the floodwater toward her. He moved with a speed and power that defied the current. He reached her in a dozen powerful strides. "Give her to me!" he shouted over the roar. Hannah passed the shivering child into his strong arms. Rafe settled the girl on his hip, then grabbed the rope still tied to Hannah's waist. "Pull!" he yelled toward the porch. Though there was no one there to hear, it didn't matter. Together, they became a single unit of resistance against the flood. He pulled on her rope, his strength a steady, immense force, while she used her own rope to guide them back, hand over fist, her arms screaming with the strain. They collapsed onto the porch, a heap of drenched, shivering bodies, gasping for air as the brown water churned just feet below them. Rafe didn't pause. He carried the child inside, directly to the hearth. Hannah followed, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand. He stripped off his own heavy, sheepskin-lined coat and wrapped it around the little girl, cocooning her in its dry warmth. "Rub her feet," he commanded, and he began to chafe the child's small, icy hands between his own large, calloused ones. Hannah knelt, her wet dress pooling around her, and took the child's mud-caked feet in her hands. She rubbed them briskly, trying to force warmth and life back into the frozen limbs. They worked in silence, their focus entirely on the small, shivering life between them. Slowly, a faint hint of pink returned to the child's skin. Her shivering subsided into occasional tremors. Her eyes, which had been wide and blank, began to focus. Hannah looked up and met Rafe's eyes over the small, blanket-wrapped form. The look on his face was one she had never seen before. The usual sternness, the owner's assessment, was gone. The worry was still there, etched in the lines around his eyes, but it was overshadowed by something else. It was a look of raw, unguarded respect. He was not looking at his cook. He was looking at the woman who had just walked into a flood. And in his eyes, she saw her own actions reflected not as recklessness, but as a strength she had never known she possessed. Dawn broke, pale and washed out. The rain had stopped, and the floodwaters were receding, leaving behind a thick blanket of stinking mud and debris. The bridge still stood, but it was battered and damaged. The world was quiet, exhausted, as Hannah was giving the little girl a small bowl of warm, sweet porridge. A small group of people appeared at the edge of the ranch. It was a native family, a man and a woman, their faces etched with a sleepless night of terror. They approached the cookhouse slowly, hesitantly. The little girl saw them and let out a small cry. "Mama!" The woman ran forward, scooping her daughter up from the stool, burying her face in the child's hair, her body shaking with silent, relieved sobs. The man, the child's father, stopped before Rafe and Hannah. He was a tall, dignified man, his face a testament to a hard life. He looked at the warm, dry child, then at them. He did not have the words in their language for what he felt, but he didn't need them. He simply placed his hand over his heart and gave them a slow, profound bow of his head. It was a gesture of gratitude so deep and sincere, it needed no translation. They took their daughter and left as quietly as they had come. Hannah stood in the doorway, watching them go. The adrenaline that had sustained her for hours was gone, and in its place, a deep, pervasive cold settled in. It started in her feet, still numb from the floodwater, and crept up her legs, into her bones. A tremor started in her hands, a violent, uncontrollable shiver that shook her entire frame. The warmth of the fire seemed 1,000 miles away. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did no good. The cold was inside her now. Rafe turned from the door, his face clouded with a new concern. "Hannah," she tried to answer, to say she was fine, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. She could feel a strange, insidious heat blooming behind her cold skin, a feverish warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth fire. She had kept the fire alive for the men. She had walked through a flood to save a child. But now, as she stood shivering in her own kitchen, a single, terrifying question echoed in the sudden silence of her mind. Who would keep the fire alive when she was the one who was burning out? The fever had been a thief, stealing a week of Hannah's life in a haze of shivering chills and sweat-soaked nightmares. But the ranch had not let her fall. Rafe had moved her cot closer to the fire, keeping watch through the night, forcing spoonfuls of broth and willow bark tea between her chattering teeth. The men had tiptoed in and out of the cookhouse, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a heavy, concerned quiet. Billy had taken over the coffee pot, and grizzled old Charlie had proven surprisingly adept at making porridge. They had kept her fire alive for her. When the fever broke, it was like waking from a long, dark dream. The strength returned to her limbs slowly, and with it came a new, fragile sense of peace. The quiet respect of the men was no longer a novelty. It was a fact, solid as the stone walls of her kitchen. The shared work with Rafe in the evenings had deepened into a comfortable silence, a language of its own, spoken in the stacking of clean plates and the banking of the evening fire. This peace was a delicate thing, a new shoot pushing up through hard ground, and it was shattered by the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach. She came to Dry Juniper like a bird of paradise blown horribly off course into a flock of sparrows. Her name was Celeste Arden. She stepped down from the coach in a dress of deep emerald silk that was utterly wrong for the season, the place, and the thick, muddy street. It was a dress made for gaslit parlors and polished floors, not the grit and wind of the Wyoming Territory. A small, fashionable hat with a single, arrogant feather was perched on her perfectly coiffed dark hair. But it was her smile that was the most out of place. It was bright and sharp and held no warmth at all. It was the smile of a woman who knew her own value and found everyone else's wanting. News of her arrival spread faster than a prairie fire. By evening, the saloon was buzzing with it. Celeste Arden, the daughter of a wealthy Cheyenne banker, was back. And everyone who had been in the territory for more than a year knew who she had been to Rafe Calder. The whispers started over glasses of cheap whiskey. They were cruel, lazy, and honed to a sharp point. Heard Calder's got himself a new cook, one man would say. Another would laugh. Heard she's got some size to her. A man gets lonely on a ranch that big. The final killing blow came from a traveling salesman, a man with a sneer as practiced as his sales pitch. A cold bed makes a man lower his standards. Looks like Calder's decided to warm his hands at the cook stove. The joke was repeated, embellished, and passed from man to man. It was an ugly, demeaning thing, reducing Hannah to a piece of furniture and Rafe to a desperate man taking whatever comfort he could find. When Jeb, the old wagon driver, came back from town with supplies the next day, the poison came with him. He didn't repeat the words, but Hannah saw it in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, in the sudden, heavy silence that fell over the ranch hands when she served the midday meal. The easy quiet of the past weeks was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward watchfulness. 2 days later, Celeste Arden came to the ranch. She arrived in a rented buggy, a flimsy, elegant thing that looked as if it would shatter on the rutted ranch road. She didn't wait to be greeted. She swept into the yard like a visiting queen, her silk dress rustling, her sharp smile fixed in place. The cowboys stopped their work, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. Celeste ignored them. Her eyes scanned the ranch, a flicker of something disdain, perhaps in her gaze. Her destination was clear. She walked directly to the cookhouse. Hannah was pulling a pan of cornbread from the oven, the warm, honest smell filling the air. The door opened, and the scent was immediately overwhelmed by a wave of expensive, floral perfume. Celeste stood in the doorway, her head tilted, taking in the scene. "Well, well," she said, her voice as smooth and cool as the silk of her dress. "So, this is the heart of the great Slate Creek Ranch. How rustic." She glided into the room, her eyes darting everywhere, assessing, judging. She ran a gloved finger along a wooden shelf and then examined the fingertip for dust. It must be a terrible challenge to maintain any sense of cleanliness out here. All this smoke and grit. Hannah stood by the stove, her hands clutching a potholder, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She felt large and clumsy in Celeste's presence, her simple canvas apron and flour-dusted hands suddenly seeming coarse and dirty. "You must be the new help," Celeste said, her eyes finally landing on Hannah. She didn't wait for a reply. "Rafe always did have a soft spot for strays. It's a wonder he manages to keep this place running at all." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. You certainly have a healthy kitchen. One can see you enjoy the fruits of your labor." It was a masterful attack. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, wrapped in the politeness of a lady but intended to draw blood. She had called Hannah a stray, dirty and fat, all without raising her voice, all while maintaining her perfect, cutting smile. The few cowboys who had gathered at the door shuffled their feet, their faces flushed with embarrassment. They knew this was cruel, but they were mesmerized by the sheer, venomous confidence of it. Celeste walked over to the pot of beans simmering on the stove, lifted the lid with the tip of a pristine finger, and sniffed. Beans. How appropriate. A simple diet for simple men, I suppose. She dropped the lid back into place with a dismissive clatter. Every word landed on Hannah like a physical blow. This was not a flood or a fever. This was the old, familiar poison of the orphanage, the butcher shop, the whispers of the town, but now it was distilled, concentrated, and delivered with the skill of an assassin. All of her deepest fears, the ones she had just begun to believe she could overcome, that she was too large, too plain, too common, were being laid bare in front of the very men she had worked so hard to win over. She looked at their faces. She saw their shame, but she also saw a flicker of doubt, the old judgments creeping back into their eyes. Celeste's poison was working. She was reminding them that Hannah was just the fat cook, an object of pity or scorn, not a person worthy of the respect they had begun to show her. Hannah couldn't breathe. The warm, safe walls of her kitchen were closing in on her, suffocating her. She felt the sting of tears, hot and shameful, welling in her eyes. She would not cry, not here, not in front of this woman. Without a word, she dropped the potholder on the table, turned, and pushed past the men clustered in the doorway. She fled. She ran across the yard, her apron strings flying behind her, her only thought to escape the sound of that smooth, cruel voice and the sight of those judging eyes. She didn't stop until she reached the line of cottonwoods that bordered the creek at the edge of the ranch property. There, hidden from view, she finally let the tears come. They were not the tears of a feverish delirium, but the hot, bitter tears of a lifetime of feeling not enough. She sank to the ground, her back against the rough bark of a tree, and sobbed, the sound torn from the deepest part of her. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually, the sound of footsteps on the dried leaves made her look up. It was Rafe. He stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his face grim. He didn't offer empty comforts or tell her not to cry. He just waited until her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I should have warned you she might come." "What does she want?" Hannah asked, her voice thick and raw. Rafe looked out across the plains, his gaze distant. "What she's always wanted, this ranch. Or rather, what it's worth." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes clear and direct. "Celeste and I were arranged. Her father's bank held the notes on my father's land. It was a business deal, meant to merge his money with my name. She thought she was marrying an inheritance she could sell. She never understood that I intended to work this land, not liquidate it. When she realized I wasn't going to sell Slate Creek and move to a fancy house in Cheyenne, she left. She found a richer man whose ambitions matched her own." He paused, the silence stretching between them. "What you saw today, that has nothing to do with you, Hannah. It's about her. She can't stand to see this place succeed. She can't stand to see anyone find any peace here, because she couldn't." His words were not a soothing balm. They were something harder and better. They were the truth. He wasn't defending her. He was explaining the battlefield. He was showing her that Celeste's arrows were not aimed at her heart, but at his, and she had simply been standing in the way. It didn't erase the sting, but it changed the nature of the wound. He extended a hand. "Come back to the cookhouse." She looked at his hand, then up at his face. "The men, they hurt her, they believe her. They're my men," he said, his voice hardening. "They'll believe what I tell them to believe." She took his hand. It was rough and calloused, but it was steady. He helped her to her feet, and together, without another word, they walked back into the main yard. Celeste was still there, holding court near the bunkhouse, regaling a few of the younger, more impressionable cowboys with a story, her laughter tinkling like broken glass. The other men stood in awkward, silent groups, pointedly not listening. When they saw Rafe and Hannah approaching, a hush fell over the entire yard. Celeste stopped mid-sentence, her smile faltering for the first time as she saw the look on Rafe's face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stopped in the center of the yard, forcing every man to look at him. He slowly, deliberately, took off his hat, a gesture of ultimate seriousness on the frontier. He held it at his side. "This ranch runs on two things," he said, his voice clear and carrying in the sudden stillness. "Hard work and a full belly. The woman standing beside me provides you with one of those things. Her work keeps you strong. Her fire warms you. Her food feeds you." He let his gaze sweep over the faces of his men, one by one, holding each man's eye for a beat. "I will not have her disrespected. Not on my land, not by anyone." He then turned his head slightly, his eyes landing on Celeste. his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "And not by outsiders who don't understand the first thing about what it takes to survive out here." He turned back to his men. "So, this is how it is. Anyone who insults the person who keeps this ranch alive, anyone who chooses cheap gossip over loyalty, you can collect your pay and ride out today." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. Celeste's face had gone pale, her sharp smile completely gone, replaced by an expression of pure, shocked outrage. She looked at the cowboys, expecting them to rush to her defense, to laugh off Rafe's ultimatum, but no one moved, no one spoke. The men who minutes before had been shuffling their feet in embarrassment now stood straighter, one by one. They looked down at their boots, at the dusty ground, anywhere but at Celeste Arden. It was a quiet, collective shunning. They had made their choice. They chose the cookhouse. They chose the steady warmth of the fire over the cold, fleeting sparkle of a visitor's wit. Celeste stood alone in the center of the yard. The silence of 20 men a resounding slap in the face. Her power, built on whispers and insinuations, had vanished into the thin Wyoming air. With a choked sound of fury, she turned on her heel, her silk dress swirling in the dust, and marched back to her buggy, her back ramrod straight. The ranch watched her go, silent and unmoving, until the sound of her rented buggy faded into the distance. The spell was broken. Men cleared their throats, spat, and slowly began to drift back to their work. The crisis averted. But Hannah remained frozen in the center of the yard, Rafe still standing quietly beside her. The poison had been drawn out. The threat had been banished. Rafe had defended her, unequivocally, in front of everyone. He had built a wall of protection around her. She should have felt relieved. She should have felt grateful. And she did. But underneath it all, a new, terrifying question began to beat in her chest, a rhythm as frantic as a stampede. He had made it safe for her to stay, but was that enough to stay because he had commanded it? Because he had made it so, or did she have the courage? Now, to look at this place, this hard, beautiful, unforgiving land, and choose to stay for herself, to claim her place not as the person who was defended, but as a person who belonged. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and for the first time, the choice was entirely her own. The choice, once made, settled in Hannah's soul like a stone in deep water. She was not the ranch's cook because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because this was her place. The work was hers, the fire was hers, and the quiet, growing respect of the men was hers. The knowledge firmed her spine. A quiet confidence began to bloom in the warmth of her kitchen. A hardy plant accustomed to a harsh climate. This new peace, however, was as fragile as a spring frost. It was broken by a freighter's wagon, laden with supplies for the coming roundup. Among the sacks of beans and crates of coffee was a shipment of flour from a mill downriver, one Rafe had never used before. It looked fine, a little grayer than usual, perhaps, but usable. Hannah, grateful for the chance to bake something other than cornbread, immediately set to work making loaves of bread for the men. The smell of it baking was the smell of civilization, of comfort, and the men's delight was a reward in itself. The trouble started 2 days later. It began with Billy, the young, freckle-faced cowboy. He came into the cookhouse for the midday meal looking pale, a fine sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the cool day. He pushed the food around on his plate, his usually healthy appetite gone. By evening, he was doubled over with cramps, a fierce sickness in his gut that left him weak and feverish. Hannah assumed it was a passing ailment, something he'd caught in the river water. She made him a simple broth and sent him to his bunk. But the next morning, 2 more men were sick. Charlie, the old hand with gnarled knuckles, and Thomas, the quiet whittler. The symptoms were identical: a burning fever, debilitating cramps, and a profound weakness that left them unable to stand. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to find a purchase in Hannah's heart, but she pushed it down. This was a problem to be solved, like an empty lard tub or a stubborn fire. She stood in the center of her kitchen, her mind racing. What was the connection? What had they all eaten? The answer was immediate and terrifying. The bread. They had all eaten heartily of the new bread. The flour was tainted. The cookhouse, her sanctuary of nourishment, had become a source of poison. Her first action was to haul the remaining sacks of flour out onto the porch, marking a larges on each one with a piece of charcoal. Her second was to begin converting her kitchen into a hospital. She moved the long dining tables against the walls, creating a wide-open space in the center of the room. The sick men, now numbering 3, were moved from the cold, drafty bunkhouse into the steady warmth of the cookhouse. She laid them on pallets of straw covered with clean blankets near the hearth. The men were scared. They were tough, hardened men, accustomed to the clean, understandable dangers of a wild horse or a winter storm. But this was a sickness from within, an invisible enemy that twisted their insides and stole their strength. They looked at Hannah with wide, feverish eyes, their usual bravado stripped away, leaving them vulnerable as children. Hannah felt a surge of fierce, protective resolve. These were her men. She fed them. She would not let them waste away. The circuit-riding doctor was 50 miles and a week away. At best, there was no help coming. She was all they had. Her mind flew back to a time in dry Juniper, her first winter there, when a similar sickness had swept through the town. She had caught it and had lain shivering and miserable in her small room behind the store. A woman had come to help her. Not a townswoman, but a native woman who lived in the hills, known to the settlers only as Auntie Roan. She was a midwife and a healer, a woman whose knowledge was written in leaves and roots, not in books. Auntie Roan had brewed her a tea, a concoction so bitter it made her teeth ache, but it had broken the fever and settled her stomach. Hannah closed her eyes, trying to remember. The ingredients. She could see Auntie Roan's hands, brown and wrinkled, stripping leaves from a dusty green plant and peeling bark from a slender branch. Sage, that was it, and willow. Rafe, she said, her voice sharp with urgency as he entered the cookhouse, his face a grim mask of concern. I need wild sage, the kind with the gray, fuzzy leaves, and I need the bark from a willow tree. The younger branches are best. He didn't question her. He didn't ask why. He saw the grim purpose on her face and simply nodded. Where? By the creek, she said, remembering Roan's words. Sage grows in the dry. Sunny spots. Willow loves the water. While he was gone, she tended to the men. The sickness was a harsh master, wringing the fluid from their bodies. Dehydration was the enemy. She dissolved salt in warm water, creating a simple rehydration solution, and began the painstaking process of spooning it into the men, a few sips at a time. Their throats were raw, their stomachs rebellious, but she was patient and relentless. She started a pot of porridge, using the safe cornmeal. She cooked it with an abundance of water until it was thin, a liquid gruel that would be easy to digest and provide some small amount of sustenance. The kitchen was no longer a place of savory aromas. It smelled of sickness and the sharp, medicinal scent of boiling herbs as Rafe returned with the sage and willow. She worked without pause. The bitter tea was brewed, a dark, pungent liquid. She cooled it and began administering it, a spoonful at a time, to the suffering men. They grimaced at the taste but were too weak to resist. The rhythm of her work was relentless, a sip of salt water, a spoonful of bitter tea, a moment to wipe a feverish brow with a cool, damp cloth. Then on to the next man. By the second day, 3 more men were sick. The cookhouse was now a full-fledged infirmary, the floor crowded with pallets, the air thick with the low moans of men in misery. The healthy hands, their faces pale with fear, took over the essential ranch chores, moving with a grim, quiet efficiency. Rafe became her shadow, her other set of hands. He was the one who hauled the endless buckets of fresh water from the well and carried out the soiled linens. He kept the fire roaring, his axe a steady, rhythmic beat in the background of their grim work. He moved among his sick men, his presence a large, reassuring solidity in the fever dream haze. Hannah watched him as he knelt by Charlie's side, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle as he wiped the old man's face with a damp cloth. He spoke to them in a low, steady voice, offering not comfort, but simple, grounding facts. "The fever will break. Charlie, Hannah's here. Just rest." They worked as a team, a silent, perfectly synchronized unit. He would see her struggling to lift a heavy kettle, and he would be there to take it from her. She would glance at the water bucket, and he would already be heading for the door. They spoke little, their communication reduced to nods, gestures, and shared, worried glances over the sick men. The barriers between them, employer and employee, ranch owner and hired cook, dissolved in the face of the overwhelming, shared task. They were simply two people fighting a common enemy. Through the long days and longer nights, Hannah worked. She lost track of time, her world shrinking to the confines of the hot, crowded kitchen. Her life was measured in spoonfuls of tea and the rising and falling of fevers. She was a general in a war fought with porridge and herbs, and she would not surrender. In a rare, quiet moment, when the men were sleeping, she found a piece of charcoal in the flat lid of a flour crate. Her mind, though exhausted, was sharp. She had to remember. She began to write down the recipe for the tea, the ratio of water to salt, the consistency of the porridge. She wrote down which man couldn't keep the tea down, who needed more water. It was a medical chart written on scrap wood, a testament to a desperate battle. Her hands shook with fatigue, and a bead of sweat dripped from her forehead onto the board, smudging the charcoal letters. The salt of her own labor mixed with the ink of her remedies. The fourth night was the worst. A new wave of fever washed over the men, leaving them delirious and thrashing in their blankets. Hannah and Rafe moved between them constantly, holding them down, forcing sips of water into their parched mouths, murmuring reassurances that they probably couldn't hear. The air was thick with the smell of fever and fear. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, Hannah was standing over a pot, stirring a new batch of willow bark tea. The room was swaying slightly, the edges of her vision turning soft and gray. She felt a profound, bottomless exhaustion, a weariness so complete it felt like her bones were turning to water. She leaned against the stove for a moment, just to steady herself. Her hand, holding the wooden spoon, stilled. The spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered to the stone floor. The sound seemed to come from a great distance. Then the light from the fire dissolved into a soft, welcoming darkness, and she knew no more. She didn't feel herself fall. She only felt, through a distant haze, strong arms scooping her up from the floor. She was lifted, her head lolling against a chest that was as solid as an old oak tree and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and worried sweat. She was carried. Rafe laid her gently on her own cot, which he had moved to the warmest, safest spot beside the hearth. His movements were deft and sure. He pulled the heavy wool blanket, the one he had left for her on the porch weeks ago, up to her chin. He felt her forehead. It was cool, clammy with exhaustion, but not with fever. She was not sick. She was simply spent, an engine that had run out of fuel. He sank into a stool beside her, his own body screaming with fatigue. He looked at her face, peaceful in sleep, the lines of worry momentarily smoothed away. He looked at the sick men, their fevers finally seeming to lessen, their breathing growing deeper, more regular. He looked at the pot of tea still simmering on the stove, the wooden spoon lying on the floor beside it. For the rest of the night, he did not sleep. He sat vigil. He watched her, and he watched the fire. He added wood to the stove with the quiet care of a nurse tending a patient, keeping the temperature steady, as if the heat of the stove and the life in her body were one and the same. He was no healer, but he knew how to guard a flame. When the first pale, gray light of dawn crept through the window, it revealed a transformation. The crisis had passed. The fevers had broken. The men were weak, washed out, and hollow-eyed, but they were lucid. The sickness had been beaten back. They lay quietly on their pallets, their eyes following Hannah as she finally began to stir. She woke slowly, to the familiar crackle of the fire and the low murmur of men's voices, softer than she had ever heard them. Her body felt heavy, as if it belonged to someone else. She opened her eyes. Rafe was sitting on the stool, his head slumped forward, asleep. His face was gray with exhaustion. As she moved, he started, his eyes snapping open. He looked at her, and a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over his features. He didn't smile. He just looked at her, his gray eyes holding a world of unspoken emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her forehead. His touch was feather-light. "The storm has passed," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. He looked over at his men, now stirring and asking for water in weak but clear voices. And then he looked back at her. "You were the shelter." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower, a sound meant only for her in the quiet morning air. "Let me be the shelter for you, Hannah." The words hung between them, simple, direct, and heavy with a meaning that went far beyond the events of the past week. It was an offer, a promise, a question, and as Hannah lay there, cocooned in the warmth of the fire he had guarded all night, she felt a flicker of something she had never dared to feel before. Hope, but it was a fragile, terrified thing. After a lifetime of storms, could she finally believe in a shelter? His words, "Let me be the shelter for you," did not fade with the morning light. They settled into the quiet spaces between them, an unanswered question that was more potent than any declaration. In the weeks that followed, as the men regained their strength and the rhythm of the ranch returned, the words hung in the air, in the shared silence as they washed the evening dishes, in the brief glances they exchanged across the crowded cookhouse. Hannah felt them as a gentle, persistent warmth, a fire banked low, waiting for a reason to blaze. The reason came on market day. Dry Juniper was transformed. Its single dusty street, normally a sleepy thoroughfare, was choked with a vibrant, chaotic flood of humanity. Trappers came down from the mountains, their buckskins smelling of pine and wood smoke, their pack mules laden with furs. Ranchers and their families arrived in sturdy wagons, the women's faces shaded by sunbonnets, the children's eyes wide with wonder. There were tables piled high with bolts of calico cloth, gleaming tins of coffee, and tools of hardened steel. The air was a thick stew of smells, hoarse and dust. Frying sausages from a vendor's cart, the sweet perfume of hay, and the low, constant hum of 100 conversations. Rafe had insisted she come. "The pantry is nearly bare," he'd said, his reason practical. "You know what we need better than I do." And so, Hannah found herself sitting on the bench of the Slate Creek supply wagon, rolling into the heart of the town that had once defined her by its pity and scorn. But she was not the same woman who had left it in the pre-dawn gloom. She sat straighter, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She was no longer just Hannah Pike. She was the cook of Slate Creek, the woman who had faced down a fever, and the quiet respect of the half-dozen recovered cowboys riding alongside the wagon was a shield more potent than any shawl. They were moving through the thickest part of the crowd when a familiar voice, sharp and sweet as poisoned honey, cut through the din. "Why," Rafe called her, "I'd heard your ranch had been struck by some unpleasantness. I see the rumors were true." Celeste Arden stood by the mercantile. A small circle of listeners gathered around her. She was dressed in a traveling suit of dove gray, elegant and out of place, her smile as sharp and polished as ever. Her eyes swept over the wagon, lingering on Hannah with theatrical disdain. "It's a shame," Celeste continued, her voice carrying, intended for the ears of anyone nearby. "When the master of a house is distracted, standards tend to fall. First the cook, then the flour. One must be so careful about what one allows onto one's property. Contamination can be so difficult to eradicate." The implication was as vile as it was clear. She was lumping Hannah in with the tainted flour, a sickness, a contamination that had brought trouble to Rafe's doorstep. She was attacking not just Hannah's cooking, but her very presence, her character, her honor. The men from Slate Creek stiffened, their hands moving instinctively closer to their sides. The crowd around them grew quiet, all eyes turning to the wagon. This was better than any street preacher's sermon. This was drama. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. She had thought herself immune, but the public nature of the attack, the way Celeste twisted the truth into a weapon, was devastating. The old shame, the feeling of being judged and found wanting, washed over her, cold and sickening. Rafe did not look at Celeste. He did not rise to her bait. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his movements were calm, deliberate. He swung down from the wagon, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He gave a curt nod to Billy. "Start loading the beans." Then he turned and walked away, not in the direction of Celeste, but toward a carpenter's stall. Celeste smiled, a small, triumphant curl of her lips. She thought he was retreating. Hannah's heart sank. She watched as he spoke briefly to the carpenter, then to a woman selling linens and dry goods. He paid for his purchases and turned back, moving now to the center of the street, where an empty freight wagon stood. He stepped up onto its flatbed, placing his items down beside him. He now had a stage. He held up his purchases for the crowd to see. One was a simple apron of deep blue linen, clean and sturdy. The other was a plain, unpainted pine board, a blank sign. A hush fell over the market. Rafe Calder was not a man for public spectacle. For him to command their attention this way meant something of consequence was about to happen. "I've lived in this territory my whole life," Rafe began, his voice not loud, but clear and resonant, cutting through the market day chatter. "I've learned what has value and what is merely decoration." His eyes swept the crowd, meeting the gazes of ranchers, merchants, and their wives. He did not look at Celeste. He was erasing her from the narrative. "I've seen what the world calls a prize. I've seen the polished smiles and the fancy dresses. I've learned that often. It's a hollow thing, brittle as a dead leaf. It cannot keep you warm in a blizzard. It cannot feed a hungry man. It cannot give you courage when you are facing the dark." He paused, letting his words sink in. He then picked up the blue linen apron. "What has value?" he continued, his voice deepening, "is strength, not the strength that boasts and preens, but the quiet, steady strength that gets up before dawn and lights the fire, the strength that walks into a flood to save a child, the strength that faces down a fever and says, 'Not on my watch.'" He looked directly at Hannah then, his gaze so intense it seemed to burn away the crowd, the noise, the entire town, leaving only the two of them. "I don't need a pretty picture to hang on my wall. I need a fire in my hearth. I don't need a conventional wife who will impress the bankers in Cheyenne. I need a woman who knows that true worth isn't in a silk dress, but in a steady hand. I need a woman who can hear a man's stomach and his heart." He held up the apron. "I need the woman who awakens the life fire, and that woman is Hannah Pike." He looked back at the crowd, his voice ringing with a final, undeniable authority. "She is the future of Slate Creek, and she is my choice." The silence that followed was so profound, Hannah could hear the blood roaring in her ears. She sat frozen on the wagon bench, unable to breathe, unable to think. He had laid his heart, his honor, and his future bare in the middle of a crowded street for all to see, for her. He stepped down from the wagon and walked to her side, his hand extended. The crowd parted for him as if he were a force of nature. "Hannah," he said, his voice now soft. "For her alone." Slowly, as if in a dream, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to help her down. He led her to the center of the street, to the freight wagon that had been his stage. He held up the blue apron. His eyes asked the question, his lips did not. Her hands trembled, her fingers feeling thick and clumsy. But she took the apron from him. She untied the strings of her old, faded canvas apron and let it fall to the dust. Then, with the entire town of dry juniper as her witness, she tied the clean, deep blue linen apron around her waist. It felt like a coronation. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The whispers that had been tinged with mockery and malicious curiosity were changing their tune. They were now sounds of awe, of disbelief, of a grudging, growing respect. The story was being rewritten, right before their eyes. Rafe turned back to the crowd, his expression softening slightly. He gestured to the Slate Creek wagon, where Billy was now standing with a stunned expression. "Billy," Rafe called out, "unload the cornmeal, and the lard. The cook is going to make griddle cakes." He raised his voice again. "Free griddle cakes for any man or woman willing to trade an old roomer for a good meal." A few nervous laughs broke the tension. Then an old rancher at the front of the crowd took off his hat. "Well, hell, Calder, I'm always willing to trade lies for victuals." He was the first. Slowly, hesitantly, a line began to form. Men who had snickered at the saloon gossip now stood with their eyes downcast, nudged forward by their wives. It was a public act of contrition, a communal apology served up with a side of hot griddle cakes. Celeste Arden stood alone. Her audience had abandoned her. The power she wielded through whispers and insinuation was useless against a truth spoken so plainly and powerfully. Her face was a mask of pale, venomous fury. Without a word, she turned to stalk away, and in her haste, the pointed heel of her elegant boot sank deep into a muddy rut left by the morning's rain. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell, her gray dress now spattered with filth. No one moved to help her. She ripped her shoe free from the mud and limped away, a solitary figure of defeated malice, erased from the story she had tried so desperately to write, in the midst of the growing, hungry, and sheepish crowd. Hannah and Rafe stood in a small pocket of silence, the sizzle of batter hitting a hot griddle, hastily set up on a makeshift fire, was beginning to fill the air. Hannah looked up at him, her heart a wild storm in her chest. She had to know. "I don't want to be chosen out of pity, Rafe," she whispered, the words a final, desperate plea for the unvarnished truth. "Not because you felt you had to defend my honor." He looked down at her, his gray eyes softer than she had ever seen them. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of flour from her cheek. "Pity doesn't rebuild a ranch. Hannah," he said, his voice low and certain. "Pity doesn't face down a fever. I didn't choose to defend you because I felt I had to. I defended you because you are the strongest person I have ever known." He took a breath. "I chose you for you." They had not kissed. A kiss felt too small, too conventional for the magnitude of the moment. Their bond had been forged not in flirtation, but in fire and flood and fever. It was a thing of substance, not of show. He picked up the blank pine sign he had bought and handed it to her. Then, he reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a small, sharp piece of charcoal. He pressed it into her palm. His voice was a quiet promise of a future yet unwritten. "Name your eatery." "Hannah." The charcoal felt heavy in her hand, heavier than any ladle or knife she had ever held. It was an instrument of creation, not for a meal that would be consumed and forgotten, but for a name for her place, her future. The crowd on market day had faded to a respectful distance, the sizzle of the griddle cakes a backdrop to the silent, monumental decision she faced. She looked at the blank pine board, then at Rafe. His eyes were steady, patient. He had given her a public declaration, a new apron, and now, a blank slate. He was not telling her what to write. He was trusting her to know. She thought of the cold stone of her kitchen and the fire she had coaxed to life within it. She thought of the grit of the land, the dust and the wind that scoured everything clean and left only what was strong. She thought of the journey from being a woman defined by what she lacked to a woman defined by what she could create. Her hand moved, the charcoal making a soft, scratching sound against the wood. The letters were not elegant or practiced, but they were bold and clear. When she was done, she stepped back. Hearth Grit. It was not just a name, it was a creed. The hearth was the fire, the warmth, the food, the heart of a home. The grit was the land, the people, the quiet, stubborn resilience it took to survive and flourish there. It was her story, written in 2 words. Rafe read the sign, and a slow, deep smile of understanding spread across his face. It was the right name. The eatery was not built in a day. It rose from the ground beside the granary, a lean-to structure with one wall open to the world, a testament to its faith in honest work and its lack of pretension. Rafe and the Slate Creek hands built it. They sank thick cottonwood posts into the earth and raised a roof of rough-sawn timber. There were no glass windows, only canvas flaps that could be rolled down against the wind and rain. Hannah designed the inside. The long dining tables and benches were built by Thomas, the quiet whittler, from the same pale, smooth wood he used for his spoons. They were sanded until they felt like silk beneath a workingman's hand, for light in the evenings. She collected empty bottles from the saloon in dry juniper, cleaned them until they sparkled, and set tallow candles in their necks. The light they cast was soft and flickering, a constellation of small, steady flames against the vast Wyoming dark. Hearthgrit opened not with a grand announcement, but like a flower, slowly, naturally. At first, it was just for the Slate Creek men, but then drovers on the cattle trails, their faces caked with dust, smelled the scent of coffee-braised beef and followed it to its source. Prospectors, their eyes still wild with the dream of gold, stopped for a bowl of bean soup thick with sage that reminded them of a home they'd long since left. Families in wagons, heading west toward a future they could only imagine, would pull over, drawn by the promise of a hot meal that was both affordable and kind. The menu was the soul of the place, and it was as honest as the land itself. It changed with the seasons and the contents of the supply wagon. The coffee-braised beef, dark and rich, became a staple, its gravy perfect for sopping up with thick slices of her chili cornbread. When a passing farmer traded a bushel of apples, she baked them whole in the embers of the stove, the skins blistered and caramelized, the insides soft as custard. She served them hot in a small bowl with a surprising, daring sprinkle of coarse sea salt that cut the sweetness and made the flavor sing. Her food was not fancy. It was elemental. It tasted of the earth, of the fire, and of the patient, steady care of her hands. One evening, after the last customer had gone, the Slate Creek men filed into the empty eatery. They were freshly washed, their hair slicked down, their expressions a mixture of solemnity and nervous energy. Billy, acting as spokesman, held out a package wrapped in brown paper. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his face turning its customary shade of red. We wanted to give you this." Hannah carefully unwrapped the gift. It was her blue linen apron, the one Rafe had given her on market day, but it was no longer plain, in careful, if sometimes clumsy, stitches of white thread. Each of the ranch hands had embroidered his name onto the fabric. Charlie's was shaky. Thomas's was precise. Billy's was a little lopsided. And beneath their names, in Rafe's surprisingly neat script, was a single line, "The keeper of the taste of home." Tears welled in her eyes. But this time they were not tears of shame or sorrow. They were tears of a deep, quiet joy, the kind that fills a space you never knew was empty. She could not speak. She simply clutched the apron to her chest, the names a tangible testament to the family she had built. One meal at a time. Her family grew in unexpected ways. One morning, the native man whose daughter she had pulled from the flood appeared at the edge of the eatery. He was alone. He did not speak, but he carried a large, carefully tied bundle of wild herbs. He laid it on a table. Through a series of simple, graceful gestures, he conveyed its purpose. He pointed to his chest and made a coughing motion, then crushed one of the leaves, releasing a sharp, clean, mint-like scent. It was a remedy for the coughs that came with the winter damp. It was a gift of knowledge, a payment of a debt with something far more valuable than coin. Hannah accepted it with a bow of her head, her heart full. She hung the bundle of herbs from a central rafter in the kitchen, where it dried slowly, its wild, healing scent becoming a permanent part of the atmosphere of Hearthgrit. It was a silent, fragrant blessing. The rhythm of her life with Rafe deepened. His promise to be her shelter was not a thing of grand gestures, but of 100 small, daily acts of care. He still washed the dishes every night. It was their time, a quiet ritual in the flickering candlelight after the world had gone to bed. The clink of plates and the slosh of water was their conversation. Sometimes, as she stood by the drying rack, her hair coming loose from its pins, he would come back from checking on the horses and, without a word, gently tuck a stem of sweetgrass he'd picked into her hair. The faint, sweet, vanilla-like scent would linger long after he'd gone, a small, secret reminder of his presence. He was the solid, unshakable wall of the eatery, and she was the fire at its center. He handled the wood, the water, the heavy lifting. She handled the flour, the salt, the alchemy of turning simple ingredients into something that nourished not just the body, but the soul. They were a partnership, balanced and true, a silent answer to the loneliness they had both known for so long. One afternoon, the weekly mail rider, a wiry man who always stopped for a bowl of stew, brought a letter. It wasn't for Rafe. It was addressed in a childish, uncertain script to the cook at Slate Creek. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron, the signed one, which she now wore every day, and carefully broke the wax seal. The letter was written on cheap, thin paper, the words formed with a heavy, earnest pressure. "Dear ma'am," it began. "My name is Esther, and I live up in the Blue Spine Hills. The circuit preacher told us a story about you. He told us what Mr. Calder said in the town square. He said you were chosen because you were strong and good, and because you knew how to light a fire." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. The story of that day had traveled, carried on the wind like a prairie seed. "Ma'am, I am not strong, and I don't know if I am good. And the other girls, they laugh at me. They say I am built like a draft horse, not a riding pony. They say my hands are too big and my shoulders too wide. They whisper that I will end up an old maid because no one wants a girl who takes up so much space." The words were a painful echo of Hannah's own past, a litany of insults she knew by heart. "What I want to ask is this. Ma'am, the preacher said you were chosen, but if all a man ever does is laugh at your shape, can a girl like me ever be truly wanted? Can I ever be chosen?" The letter ended there, without a signature, just the raw, desperate question hanging in the air. Hannah sank onto a stool, the letter trembling in her hand. The bustling warmth of her kitchen faded away, replaced by the memory of a cold, lonely room behind a general store. She was no longer Hannah Pike, the respected owner of Hearth Grit. She was a frightened girl again, her worth measured only by her waistline. This letter was not from a stranger. It was from the girl she used to be. The responsibility of it was immense. The answer she gave could be a lifeline, or it could be just another stone to weigh a young girl's heart down. How could she explain the journey? How could she put into words the slow, painful alchemy of turning shame into strength? She sat for a long time, the sounds of the ranch fading into a dull hum. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor. Rafe came in, his boots quiet on the wooden planks. He saw the letter in her hand, the look on her face, and he understood. He did not speak. He simply filled a cup with fresh coffee and placed it on the table beside her. Then he lit a candle, its small, steady flame pushing back the growing darkness. Hannah looked from the flame to the letter. She picked up a pen, its nib sharp and clean. She dipped it in the inkwell. The blank piece of paper on the table seemed as vast and intimidating as the Wyoming sky. The hopeful, terrified heart of a young girl she had never met was waiting. And Hannah, who had built a life on feeding the hungry, now had to find the words to feed a starving soul. She held the pen, her knuckles white, and hesitated. What could she possibly say to make that girl believe the pen felt alien in her hand? A tool of words, not of substance. For hours, she sat with Esther's letter, the candle flame a solitary, wavering star in the quiet dark of the eatery. The question on the page was a ghost from her own past, a whisper she had carried in her heart for a lifetime. Can a girl like me ever be truly chosen? She thought of the girls at the orphanage, their easy laughter and slender frames. She thought of Mr. Gable, the butcher, his hand always moving toward the finest cuts for the slimmest waists. She thought of Celeste, her beauty a weapon honed to a razor's edge. For so long, she had believed the answer to Esther's question was no. She had believed her worth was something to be granted by others, a prize she was too large to ever win. But then she looked around the eatery. She saw the spoon Thomas had carved for her, its pale wood glowing in the candlelight. She saw the bundle of herbs from the native family, a fragrant, silent blessing hanging from the rafters. She saw the blue linen apron draped over a chair, its fabric covered in the names of men who had become her family. These were not prizes she had been given. They were gifts she had earned. They were the fruits of her own fire. She dipped the pen in the inkwell. The answer she had to give Esther was not a comforting lie, but the hardest, most beautiful truth she had ever learned. "Dear Esther," she wrote, her hand steady now, "I have read your letter, and my heart knows the shape of your question. I have lived inside that question for many years. The world has a loud voice, and it is quick to tell us our value. It measures us like cattle at a market, by our size and shape, and it will always find a reason to mark us down. The whispers you hear are not about you. They are the echoes of a fear in the hearts of those who speak them. They fear what is strong, what is substantial, what takes up its rightful space in the world. Do not make their fear your own. Do not make their smallness your measure." She paused, looking at the fire glowing in the hearth, a low, steady pulse in the heart of the room. "You ask if you can be chosen. I am writing to tell you a truth that took me a long time to learn. Waiting to be chosen is a fool's game. It is a hunger that can never be filled, because it asks another person to decide your worth. That is a power you should never give away. So I will tell you this. Esther of the Blue Spine Hills, do not wait. Do not look for your value in the eyes of a boy who is too blind to see it. Do not listen for your name on the lips of girls who only know how to whisper. Turn your back on their noise. Turn your face to your own life. You say you are built like a draft horse. Then be one. Be strong enough to pull your own wagon. You say your hands are large. Then make them useful. Learn to bake bread, to mend a fence, to soothe a fever, to build something that will last. A woman's strength is not a thing to be apologized for. And here is the secret. Do not do it for them. Do it for you. Light your own fire. It does not have to be a grand bonfire. A small, steady flame in a well-tended hearth is enough. Feed it with your work, with your kindness, with whatever skill you can learn. Make your corner of the world warm and bright. Make it smell of good bread and strong coffee. She dipped the pen again, the final words coming from the very center of her soul. Stop waiting to be chosen. Choose yourself. Build your own fire. And I promise you, Esther, the right kind of person does not seek out a perfect, cold statue. They are drawn to the warmth. They will find their way to your fire. She signed it simply. Hannah Pike, Hearthgrit. Her hands were dusty with flour from the day's baking. She folded the letter carefully, the fine white powder leaving a faint, ghostly print on the dark ink. She did not have a proper envelope. Instead, she dripped a pool of hot wax from the candle onto the seam and pressed the bottom of a salt cellar into it, creating a simple, sturdy seal. The mail rider was passing through before dawn. She met him in the yard as the sky was turning from black to a soft, bruised purple. She pressed a coin and the letter into his hand, along with a warm, heavy package wrapped in cloth. "For your journey," she said. It was a small loaf of bread, still warm from her oven. "And this," she added, her voice full of a quiet urgency. "This is for a girl in the Blue Spine Hills. Please see that it finds her." He nodded, tucked the letter safely into his saddlebag, and with a tip of his hat, rode off into the growing light. As she turned back, Rafe was standing on the eatery's porch. He held something in his hands. It was a book, bound in dark, worn leather, its corners softened with age. He held it out to her. "This was my mother's," he said. Hannah took it with a reverence she would have given a holy text. She opened the cover. On the first few pages, in a delicate, faded script, were recipes for apple butter and pot roast, but most of the book was empty, its thick, creamy pages waiting. She always said a family story is written in its meals, Rafe said, his voice a low rumble. She never got to finish it. He looked at Hannah, his gray eyes full of a quiet, profound emotion. Fill it, Hannah. Fill it with the food that keeps people in each other's lives. It was not a proposal that came with a diamond ring and a bended knee. It was something far more real. He was giving her his past and trusting her with their future. He was asking her to write their story. That night, they stood together in the doorway of the eatery. A gentle wind, no longer mean and scouring, blew from the plains, carrying the sweet scent of cured hay and warm pine. There was no need for a church, no need for a preacher or a crowd of witnesses. Their vows had already been made. In the quiet rhythm of their shared work, in the face of flood and fever and the venom of old rumors. He took her hand, his rough, calloused palm enveloping hers. "You are my shelter from the storm." "Hannah," he said, his voice a quiet promise meant only for her. She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt as if it might spill over. "And you," she whispered, "are the keeper of my fire." The next day, the men of Slate Creek, with a great deal of hammering and whooping, erected a new, smaller sign beneath the main one. It was carved by Thomas, the letters painted by Billy. When they were done, they let out a ragged cheer. The sign now read, "Hearth Grit, Home Kept Here." The news of Celeste Arden's departure had become old gossip, and like a fire starved of fuel, it had died out. She had left dry juniper on the same stagecoach that had brought her, leaving behind nothing but the faint, fading memory of a sour perfume. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Hannah, with her mother-in-law's book open on the counter, began to experiment. She felt a new creative freedom, a desire to make food that was not just for survival, but for joy. She learned from Rafe how to smoke a chicken over hickory chips until the skin was crisp and golden and the meat was imbued with a deep, woodsy flavor. She created a sauce from wild plums and crushed walnuts. The first time she served it, the entire ranch yard filled with an aroma so rich and new. It smelled like a memory no one had yet made, a promise of happy days to come. About a month after she had sent her letter, the mail rider came again. He had another letter, this one addressed to her by name. The handwriting was the same, childish and earnest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter contained only a few words, but they were the ones she had been waiting for, the ones that told her the circle was complete. "Dear Mrs. Pike," it read, "Thank you. I am going to learn how to cook." Hannah stood in the doorway of her eatery, the letter in her hand, and looked out at the vast, beautiful, unforgiving land that she now called home. Rafe was mending a fence by the corral, his strong, steady presence a constant on the horizon. The smell of baking bread wafted from her kitchen. A deep, profound peace settled over her. She smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached her eyes. Her fire was burning brightly, and its warmth was now strong enough to light the way for others. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.